Hi everyone. Today I'm going to go over the final part of the USA specification. So we're going to focus on part 3, which is all about post-World War II America. And we're going to look at American society and the economy during this time, some of the racial tension and developments in the civil rights campaigns, and then America and the Great Society, and also the developments in feminism in this era as well. So we're going to start with why America was so wealthy during the 1950s. And during the 1950s, America was producing nearly half of the world's goods. During the 1950s, the gross national product of America, the total value of all the goods and services they produced, doubled. And this leads to a lot of prosperity in America. As before, when we talked about this in the 1920s, this doesn't mean that it's totally evenly shared out, but generally America's going through a prosperous time. People have money in their pockets to spend, and this really influences the lifestyle in this period. We see a boom in consumerism, in particular, a boom in the sale of consumer goods. And this is due to a number of reasons. First of all, there is an acceptance of the idea that goods don't last forever, that you have to replace them in the end by newer models. Wealth spreads further down the social scale than it has previously, and therefore increasing groups in society are able to buy these goods. It becomes the norm to have certain goods like fridges and televisions no longer seen as a luxury for the wealthier people to have. Increasingly, most people in society have these things. You get the continuation of things that we first talked about in the 1920s, like hire purchase, spreading out the cost over time, meaning that more people can buy, even people on more modest incomes. Shopping becomes a hobby, especially with the development of the motor car as well. People going out to like these malls, shopping malls, and spending some time at their weekend shopping there. And there's continually increases in advertisements as well, again, encouraging people to buy. This all feeds into this idea of the American dream. Now, the American dream is this concept that no matter what your starting point in society, if you have the ability, if you have the drive and the work ethic, that you can achieve anything. So it doesn't matter if your parents, for example, came from very kind of modest, humble backgrounds that you did. If you have the ability, the drive, then you can become even the president of the USA. And this is a great aspiration for people at this time, to drive on and really improve themselves and really achieve their full potential. I suppose accompanying this comes this move out to suburbia at this time. Many wealthy white Americans begin to move out of the kind of crowded inner cities out to the new suburbs and start enjoying an even better standard of living. By 1960, the standard of living for the average American was 3 times higher than it was for the average Brit. And with what we've just been talking about the booming consumerism and American wealth at this time, it's perhaps easy to see why this was such a prosperous time. All of this leads to the emergence of the teenager. You can see some images there of teenagers in this period. And this definition of what a teenager is begins to shift. Of course, there had been people of the ages 13 to 19 before. These people had obviously existed in previous periods. But previously, it had been difficult to kind of see where these people have fit in. In the past, perhaps, people of these teenage ages were seen as either kind of like slightly older children or not quite old enough adults yet. There hadn't really been a definition of this teen culture, but this now begins to shift. And it begins to shift, I suppose it's tied in with this wealth in America that we've just been talking about. Increasing this group has more leisure time than previous generations. So unlike previous generations that would go out very kind of young to work and make a contribution to the family, because American families are generally wealthier, there isn't that same pressure on teenagers to do this and to contribute to family finances the way that had existed previously. And they have more leisure time, more spending power, because families tend to be better off. And of course, they hadn't yet entered the full responsibilities of adulthood. So they have a bit of money in their pockets, but they don't have to worry about paying the mortgages or supporting children by and large. Many of these people also have access to cars as well. So this whole kind of teen culture begins to emerge and develop. Part of this is all just about making money as well, isn't it? People want to kind of target the teenagers and want them to get to spend the money that they have on their pockets on the things that they have to offer. So you see all this teen culture developing, teen movies, music, all sorts of things. So there are films that target the teen culture and help it to develop in this period. Things like Rebel Without a Cause, starring James Dean, The Wild One, starring Marlon Brando, are all good examples of teen movies at this time. You can see the poster advertising Rebel Without a Cause on your screen there. Warner Brothers' challenging drama of today's teenage violence. James Dean, the bad boy from a good family. I suppose playing on fears of what teenagers were up to at this time, as well as really appealing to teens of this era. The new rock and roll music began to emerge as well. So like we talked about with jazz in the 1920s, now in the 50s, we're talking about young people being into rock and roll music. And much like we talked about with jazz, again, controversial, older generations really being very concerned about this. Elvis Presley, that you can see in the image there, had the nickname Elvis the Pelvis. People thought his dancing was very kind of sexualized, and people were very kind of worried about what young people were listening to and being exposed to. Television ownership also increases significantly. You can see those statistics there are quite astonishing. You go from 1948 with less than 1% of households owning a television. By 1958, 10 years later, over 80% of households owning a television. And this leading to, I suppose, a shared culture at this time, people tuning into similar television programs, and people really getting into the television and what it has to offer in this period. Also along this period, we see an increasing fear of communism. Now, we last talked about this in the 1920s with the Red Scare in the 20s, and we get another Red Scare in the 50s. This, first of all, builds on fears that had existed from earlier periods. So after the Russian Revolution in 1917, Americans had been afraid that communism would spread from Russia, which had led to this earlier Red Scare. But now it revives, and it revives with this onset of the Cold War. It particularly revives as there's a fear that Russia was now even stronger. So there had been a fear that communism might spread, and Russia now seems stronger than ever. After World War II, if you think about the defeat of Nazi Germany, well, from Western Europe, countries like Britain, America had kind of advanced and defeated Nazi Germany by advancing from Western Europe. Russia had done the same from Eastern Europe. But as Russia had taken over territory, places like Poland, for instance, it had taken over areas of Eastern Europe, and now wasn't kind of giving them up. There was initially a promise that there would be free and fair elections. These don't materialise, and they remain under communist control. This, combined with the fact that in 1949 China becomes communist, leads to great fears that there'd already been this fear of communism. Now is communism growing, spreading, becoming even stronger with these developments in foreign policy in this period. And this is truly the era of the Cold War, where Russia and the USA don't directly fight each other in this period, but they're using propaganda and foreign policy to try to gain an advantage and prevent the other from becoming more powerful. And relations between the two countries are very, very bad in this period. And these fears heighten further with the start of the Korean War in 1950, where Soviet Russia backs North Korea. The Americans go to fight with the people in South Korea. Sometimes they call this a war by proxy between these two countries at the time, that they both fight by backing other sides, again leading to this heightened fears of communism within this period. So the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, had originally been set up in the 1930s to investigate radical groups which had been set up during the Depression. Now, as the Cold War starts, post-World War II, the committee begins to investigate suspected communists at home in America with greater vigour than before. After 1947, HUAC became particularly well known as it held a series of high-profile hearings claiming that communists disloyal to America had infiltrated government, schools, the entertainment industry, and many other areas of American life. All of this is encouraged by Senator Joe McCarthy, who claimed that he had a list of over 200 known communists who were working in the American government. Sometimes we therefore call this period of the Red Scare McCarthyism as well, as this was this targeting of people suspected of communist loyalties in this time. In the end, McCarthy goes too far with this. There's hearings against the army in this period, against people that he believes are spreading communism and have communist beliefs within the army. But his questioning of them is seen to be so kind of brutal and disrespectful, and it's all being televised, that McCarthy loses a lot of popular support. People think he's gone too far in attacking these army veterans and questioning their loyalty to the country. So this eventually begins to die down, but not before it's damaged many people's careers, as they're blacklisted for either being suspected of communist sympathies or refusing to cooperate with HUAC at this time. The civil rights campaigns are also going on in the 1950s and 1960s. So despite the contribution that many African Americans had made to the war effort, prejudice continued, and this was particularly severe in the southern states. In many southern states, the Jim Crow laws continued, and this enforced segregation, enforcing segregation of everyday facilities such as parks, buses, schools, having separate facilities for Black and white people. African Americans did technically have the right to vote in this period, but in some states various practices were used to prevent them from voting, most commonly just the threat of violence, that if people went to try to register to vote or tried to go to cast their vote, then they would face massive intimidation and attack. So as a result of this, for instance, only 5% of the African American population in Mississippi was actually registered to vote in this time. The police failed to stop attacks on these people and indeed frequently take part in them. There's official and legal discrimination in employment, in education, and the best universities are closed to Black people in this period as well, further limiting their opportunities to advance within this time. So one of the first battlegrounds for the civil rights movement was education. At this time, as we've said, there are many segregated schools, especially in the southern states of the USA. The states argued that this was legal, as they said that these schools, you can see in bold there, were separate but equal. In other words, they argued that yes, they have separate schools, but they are providing an equal standard of education. In reality, this was a lie. These schools were often much more poorly funded, and as a result, African American students did not have the same quality of education offered to them that white students did. A landmark case in this is Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education in 1954, where the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, stated that segregated education could not be considered equal, and he ordered all states, especially the southern states where this was often going on, to set up integrated schools. A famous case connected with this later on took place in Little Rock in Arkansas in 1957, who even 3 years after this ruling was still resisting integrated schools. You can see an image there on the right of Elizabeth Eckford trying to attend her first day at school in 1957 in Little Rock. In this area, they were ordered to admit African American students to the white schools, but the governor in this area used the National Guard, used his state troops to prevent the African American troops from attending this school, and you can see the abuse that she faced on her first day as she tried to attend this school. An event that many people are familiar with is the Montgomery bus boycott now in 1955 on into 1956. Montgomery in Alabama had a local law that Black people were only allowed to sit in the middle and the back seats of the bus, and even these seats, they have to give those up if white people wanted them, if a white person boarded the bus and didn't have a seat of their own. Rosa Parks, who's a civil rights activist, challenged this law by refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger, and she was arrested and convicted of breaking the bus laws. This led to the Montgomery Improvement Association, which Martin Luther King is involved in leading a bus boycott, by which we mean that African Americans in this area refused to use the buses. This is a big campaign, and the bus company lost 65% of their income at this time. People walked, or sometimes they set up like little carpools, people kind of offering lifts to people so that they can avoid using the buses but still get to where they need to be. In the end, by December 1965, the Supreme Court again takes a role and declares that Montgomery's bus laws were illegal. This meant that segregation of these public services became illegal. This is followed up by the sit-ins, which again challenged segregation, but this time at lunch counters. So this was a student-led campaign by the SNCC. And it's launched at Greensboro in North Carolina, although it later spreads to other local areas as well. Their local branch of Woolworths, a department store at this time, had a lunch counter which had stools, but the stools were only for white customers. Black customers had to stand to eat. On the first day of the protest, 4 Black students sat on the white-only seats, asked for service, and when they were refused, they continued to sit in the seats, refused to leave. Another example of non-violent protests. The next day, 23 more students did the same, 66 students the following day. And within a week, this is spreading on a much wider scale. This, again, forced desegregation of lunch counters. By the end of 1960, lunch counters have been desegregated in 126 cities, often even businesses themselves taking the decision to desegregate because this had such a damaging effect on business. The freedom rides are connected to what we were just talking about with the Montgomery bus boycott. That even though the Supreme Court had declared segregated transport to be illegal, it was becoming apparent that this hadn't always been enforced in places. So this group of freedom riders start out in Washington, D.C., and they try to, as a mixed group of white and black campaigners, so they try to ride the buses together all the way further and further south to try to see whether this desegregation has actually happened in practice. So this begins in May 1961, and these campaigners face some of the worst violence of the whole civil rights campaign. This Freedom Ride campaign continues and draws a lot of attention to the issues that there are with continuing segregation in practice, and this does lead to better enforcement of integrated bus services in the future. Now, one of the most famous events of the Civil Rights campaign is Martin Luther King and his I Have a Dream speech. He gives this speech at the March on Washington in August 1963. And this is all about enforcing Black people's right to vote in this period. Now, we've already said this wasn't all about them technically gaining the right to vote. Legally, technically, they did have the right to vote. In practice, though, this was being denied to many people. And this was about him challenging that and encouraging people to use their right to vote and encouraging the dismantling of local laws that have prevented Black people from voting in practice. And this event had a huge impact on American public opinion, again, partly through the non-violent strategies that he's using. He, of course, did face some opposition. So you see more radical people within this movement at this time. For instance, Malcolm X becoming one of the most well-known people. You can see some of the quotes on the screen in front of you associated with Malcolm X. You can see this one on the bottom left. I don't favour violence. If we could bring about recognition and respect of our people by peaceful means, well and good. Everybody would like to reach his objectives peacefully. But I'm also a realist. The only people in this country who are being asked to be non-violent are Black people, pointing out that the violence that Black people were often facing in their campaigns, and he thought it was unfair and unrealistic that Black people were being asked to remain non-violent when they face such violence themselves. You can see the one above his head as well concerning non-violence. It's criminal to teach people not to defend themselves when they are the victims of constant brutal attacks. So people like Malcolm X disagreed with the tack that Martin Luther King was taking by sticking to this non-violent line. He believed that sometimes violence was justified. And this develops into this Black nationalist movement, which rejected non-violence and argues that force was justified to achieve equality. There are some key groups within this, like the Nation of Islam, led by Elijah Muhammad. This is the movement that Muhammad Ali, the boxer formerly known as Cassius Clay, joins, and Malcolm X himself is part of this, so he splits from this group later on. Even more radical than that were the Black Panthers, who had about 2,000 members and were a political party, but also a private army. This group particularly tried to challenge police brutality against African Americans at this time. And there was a wave of race riots between 1965 and 67, especially in places like Detroit, for instance, because of concerns over these racial issues within this period. There is debate over how successful this more radical Black Power movement was. It clearly did attract national attention to the disillusionment of many African Americans, but some people have said that it alarmed moderate opinion and alienated people who might otherwise have been sympathetic towards the civil rights movement. Certainly people held this movement partly responsible for the race riots at this time as well. And even some civil rights movement leaders criticised the Black Power movement, arguing that it gave law enforcement authorities just an excuse to crack down on all African American activists at this time, whether or not they were violent. There are several important achievements that are made at this time. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it illegal for local government to discriminate in areas such as housing and employment. In Selma in 1965, Martin Luther King again tries to push this issue of the right to vote for African Americans. He targeted areas where the problem was worse. So this is why he picked Selma, where only 2.4% of eligible African American adults were actually registered to vote. The march was banned, but goes ahead anyway. And these marches faced brutal violence, which draws massive attention to what Martin Luther King was campaigning about. This has an impact in the Voting Rights Act in 1965 being brought in later this year. This allowed government agents to inspect voting procedures to make sure that they were taking place properly and that people weren't being denied their legal right to vote. This ended the literacy test requirement, which had previously been used to discriminate against African Americans. And after 1965, 5 major American cities had black mayors, showing how immediately this begins to have an impact. There's a further Civil Rights Act in 1968 dealing with another aspect of discrimination. Housing now could not be sold or rented on the basis of race, religion, national origin, or sex. But Martin Luther King is assassinated in 1968. It's never been properly proven who was behind this. The social policies of Kennedy and Johnson. So Kennedy served as president from January 1961 until his assassination in November 1963. And he certainly leads, during this time period, a series of reforms being approved by Congress. So you can see that really he's trying to improve what America offers to some of the least well off. The extension of unemployment benefits, increases in social security benefits, aid to poor cities to try to improve housing and transportation, aid to economically distressed areas, trying to expand rural electrification programs, trying to provide help to farming. And after Kennedy is assassinated, Johnson develops this in his Great Society program, where he lays out his important ideas to tackle problems of unemployment, bad housing, and inadequate medical care. He manages to get a number of important reforms through Congress. The Economic Opportunity Act, providing training to disadvantaged youths and recruiting volunteers to work and teach in low-income and slum areas. Medicare and Medicaid in 1965, trying to provide medical insurance for the over 65s and hospital care for the poor. This was meant to expand medical coverage to people who would not otherwise be able to afford it, because most Americans have private health insurance. This was meant to expand it to those people who couldn't access that, who couldn't afford it. And the Development Act of 1964 provided money for replacing inner city slums with new homes. And there are schemes to help highway safety, to try to help to ensure clean water supplies, better quality air. All these developments are helping to reform Johnson's vision of the Great Society. There is criticism of the reforms, particularly from Republicans who objected to the government intervening so much in people's lives. They saw the reforms as an attack on people's freedoms. Of course, it's not perfect as well. Many people, particularly African Americans, are still living in poor quality housing. And certainly Johnson's legacy is tainted by America's growing involvement in the Vietnam War, so much so that he decides to not even stand for re-election in 1968 because it was seen as his responsibility, the growing toll of deaths and injuries of American troops in Vietnam. The final thing we need to look at is the development of feminism in this era. And Betty Friedan is one of the key thinkers of this era. You can see on the left-hand side of your screen one of her important quotes. Each suburban wife struggles with it alone. As she made the bed, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night. She was afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, is this all? And you can see on the right hand side what she was really getting at here. This idea that she believed that women were being stopped at a state of evolution far short of their abilities and their capacities. And she believed that this was leading to great dissatisfaction for women and disillusionment for women. And she believed it was a loss to society as well, that women were not able to make their full contributions and reach their full potential. So Betty Friedan is involved in setting up, amongst other women as well, the National Organization for Women Now, which is set up in 1966. This group is demanding a constitutional amendment for equal rights, guaranteeing in law their ability to be treated equally. The enforcement of a law banning sex discrimination in employment. So at this time, it wasn't unusual, for instance, for certain vacancies and certain posts to be only for men. So, for example, there's clips of women at this time saying that they wanted to become pilots, but the pilot training program was only for men. They were only allowed to become air stewardesses, for example. Maternity leave rights in employment and social security benefits. Tax deduction for home and childcare expenses, better provision of child daycare centres to free women up so that they can go to work. Equal and unsegregated education, so no more, again, of courses being only for men. Equal job training opportunities and allowances for women in poverty, and the right of women to control their reproductive lives with their ability to better access things like the contraceptive pill and also abortion rights too. This leads to a number of big successes. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 established the principle that women should receive equal pay for doing the same job as men. And in 1972, this is developed by a further Equal Pay Act that have removed some restrictions and exemptions from that earlier act. Roe versus Wade is a very, very important act which makes abortion legal and establishes it as a fundamental right. And the Supreme Court ruling on equal rights in 1972 gave access to contraception for unmarried couples on an equal basis to married. So you might previously have seen things about how the contraceptive pill began to revolutionise women's sex lives in the 1960s, because now they could control their own contraception by taking the pill and trying to prevent pregnancy in that way. In reality, when women went to try to access this, they couldn't always. So it would be given out to married women. So say you were married and you had several children and you went to the doctor to say that you wanted the pill so that you didn't want to expand your family anymore, you would be prescribed this. But unmarried women who wanted to take the pill, sometimes they were being denied the access to this because still some people at this time wanted to discourage sex outside marriage. Now the Supreme Court ruling has taken place. This gives people a legal right to access that contraception, whether or not they're married. So this brings us to the end of part 3, post-war America, and it brings us to this end of this series of videos. This is this final one on your American revision. You can see all the different things that we've covered there. So we've talked about post-war American society and the economy, the civil rights movement, the Great Society, and feminism. As I've said at the end of all these videos, I would suggest that your next steps should be to rewatch this video as many times as you need to, use your revision guide to support your revision, use your printed notes, either the full or the simplified versions. You should hopefully have these already. They're all available on the shared area, but by all means contact your class teacher if you haven't got these and can't find them. Make your own revision notes. I know lots of people like to make their own revision notes on index cards, but then do something with them. Use these to test yourself or get someone else to test you. Look at past paper questions, either practice the full thing or bullet point, mind map your answers. Thanks for watching the video. I hope that you found it useful. Please remember that this is the last one, so there are 2 more preceding this if you've kind of addressed these in a bit of a strange order. So this isn't everything for the USA. There's 2 more before this. And good luck for your exams. Thank you. Goodbye.